All right, we have a whole host of new Nintendo Switch 2 news stories to get through today, starting with the MIG Switch, which you might be familiar with. It is a flash cartridge essentially that lets you play your Switch 1 library of games when backed up and dumped onto an SD card, then fits into a cartridge slot, and it's been smooth sailing for most people on the Switch 1. Not the case with Switch 2 though, and there's actually a pretty big update around that entire situation because there's a new video that is claiming that with a firmware update to this cartridge that MIG Switch is currently working on, they are able to get Switch 1 games to boot from this cartridge reader onto Switch 2. So we're going to go over the implications of that and also some warnings if you are potentially thinking about utilizing this in a Switch 2. There is also a first look available at the Nintendo Switch 2 dev kit, which I find interesting and I want to walk through with you all. Capcom is counting the sales of game key cards under the digital section, which is kind of an interesting conversation and one that these companies will have to unpack now that we have these game key cards in this generation. And also there's some exciting work being done for kind of a niche product that many people might not utilize, but with the storage situation on the Nintendo Switch 2, it's good to know that it's coming. And we have an HDR tip for everybody who's setting up their Switches if they feel like the HDR doesn't look just quite right, and a quick update around the Metroid Prime retrospective book that you might remember we talked about a while back on the channel, and seems like it will be hitting retail store shelves a little bit later than expected, but this is a good opportunity to revisit the likelihood of Prime 2 and 3 still may be coming over before then. So we're going to unpack all of these details, but before we do, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on your bell notification to join Sunbro Nation if you're new here. We're going to first kick off this conversation with an update around MIG Switch, that cartridge reader that you probably remember came out towards the end of the Nintendo Switch's life cycle. They took forever to ship out, but they did eventually show up, and this is essentially something that allows you to play your Switch 1 library of games from an SD card when it's all said and done. But there are some limitations to it, and currently on Switch 2, it has not been working so far. But you have here this post that says play Switch 1 games on Switch 2, and this is an official statement from MIG Switch, but posted up in this particular Twitter post. While we're working on the next MIG flash card and dumper updates, we obviously had to take a break and add a feature everyone has been asking us about in the mail, playing Switch 1 games on the brand new Nintendo Switch 2. To keep everyone calm, here's a quick video of our new beta firmware running on the Switch 2. We're very rigorous and serious about any update and don't want to rush an update. So please be a little patient, but it won't be long before the final firmware is released. Thank you all for your support and patience. And you do have a video that, obviously it's easy to fake things on the internet nowadays, but you might remember the MIG Switch account posted up these type of videos before we knew it was a real product and not a total scam. And it did end up checking out and actually being something that people were able to utilize. So because of the sourcing of this video, I do tend to believe that whatever firmware they got the cartridge to read, it is probably bypassing how Nintendo identified the MIG Switch being not a genuine cartridge, because so far on the Nintendo Switch 2, it has been completely unable to boot into games, and we clearly see echoes of wisdom starting up right from this video here. Now, we did have another user that also chimed in online kind of around what's happening here, or at least in their opinion, which this may check out to be exactly what they changed with the firmware upgrade or not. But you have a Chinese video shows MIG Flash being able to run Switch 1 games on Switch 2. Not sure if it's true, but the poster did say that something changed in the MIG Flash identification transistor. If true, this indicates that Nintendo bars the use of MIG Flash by checking its voltage. So essentially the way that Nintendo has come up with to try to fight off MIG Switch and its compatibility with the Switch 2 is by identifying a difference in voltage of the actual cartridge of the MIG Switch than their stock games. And so if that is the case, maybe there is a pretty simple workaround for the MIG Switch team to actually be able to update the firmware and have it run at a different voltage and essentially bypass the way that Nintendo is detecting that as not a genuine cartridge. Now, here's one thing you're going to want to be aware of, because if you do just dump your own games with the MIG dumper that you can buy along with the MIG Switch cartridge, and you're really only playing your own game library through it on a Switch 1, and or if this becomes available on a Switch 2, not a big deal. But the minute you do try to use it for piracy or anything like that, Nintendo already has this pretty much figured out, and it should not be utilized for any kind of non-legitimate games, because your cartridge does have a specific serial number or key tied to it that the internet checks at some point as long as you are online. And the minute that a server gets a hold of a double key, meaning like a game that its genuine code is already being used somewhere else, it will mark that completely as non-genuine and potentially ban and completely render your console not usable potentially. I mean, the new user agreement, Nintendo can technically brick your console for modding it and things like that, but I don't think that we're really going to see Nintendo actively searching for that stuff. But if they do detect non-genuine copies on their servers, you're trying to play Splatoon 3 after the new update online, and it's somebody's pirated copy from the MIG switch that they were able to boot up and into, and then you're trying to connect to their servers, you're going to have a problem. You're probably not going to be able to play on that same Nintendo account and or potentially Nintendo Switch 2. So the rule of thumb is if you're messing around with anything like that, you are not supposed to be online to begin with. And really, MIG switch from a library management standpoint, I am a fan of having the ability to back up your games and utilize them that way. But obviously when used for piracy, not the right call, and won't even get you very far if you do want to mess around with stuff like that. Okay, continuing on next, we have a first look at the Nintendo Switch 2 dev kit, NDK Core Ounce. And you probably remember a lot of the different talk about Ounce being the code name for Nintendo Switch 2 and all of that, and you can see some distinct differences right from the images here. Kind of a dual USB-C looking port, kind of some maybe a custom cable that they actually plug into it. Most things are pretty similar to the actual Switch we have available currently, but definitely different types of docks, layouts, and hookups that you would not see from a typical Switch. You have both USBs actually being utilized here, top and bottom. And obviously when you're developing things for a game, that's definitely going to be very different and a different environment for your Switch 2 than whenever you are just a retail consumer that's purchasing a finished game. But you do also have kind of a Nintendo pointing out here that Switch 2 dev kits use some kind of custom cable to connect the bottom USB-C and something else. It's like a double USB-C, and that's demonstrated here. So don't know where these images actually stemmed from in terms of, who leaked these out there, but this is what a Switch 2 dev kit looks like, and kind of interesting, a little bit less interesting now that we have the console available in our hands. But nonetheless, if you were wondering what the developers are working with when they're crafting Switch 2 games, we now have a little bit of a look at that here, thanks to Nintendo for sharing this out there. Okay, from here, the big conversation around game key cards has not slowed down online, and Capcom is actually bringing this back with some headlines because, we'll read through it together. Capcom says it considers Switch 2's controversial game key cards titles as digital sales. The digital keys in a box have attracted criticism from preservationists. And you have asked in its most recent financial results whether sales of game key card titles Street Fighter 6 are recorded by the company as physical or digital units. The company stated that they would be recorded as digital sales. Game key cards have attracted criticism around the Switch 2's launch for the fact that they contain no more than a digital activation key for game titles rather than any game data. The only difference between a game key card title and a digital download is that the former can be resold and will work on other Switch 2 systems without the need for a virtual game card lending. So far, the majority of third-party Switch 2 games are game key cards, with only a few exceptions, reportedly because only one size of card is available to developers, which is 64 gigabytes. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds as more companies do their initial sales reports and things for Nintendo Switch 2. But so far, we do have, them kind of being slotted in and considered as digital sales, which is interesting because you do have the ability to go buy these off of a retail shelf. But still, Capcom, the way they are classifying it, because I guess they're not shipping the data of the game on a physical medium, they're counting that as a digital sale. And again, as VGC outlined, the big distinction is you can resell game key cards, but there for me as a hardcore lifelong physical collector, I really I may pick up a few game key cards here and there, but it's not the priority. Anything that's complete on game on cartridge, I will definitely still pick up physical this generation for Switch 2. But when you are just putting in a cartridge to do a full download and it's going on your entire internal system memory, I do definitely think that some of the appeal of the physical option goes away when digital is obviously so much more convenient on other fronts, outside of the fact that I'm going to miss not having as big of a game case collection this generation. But There is also just a quick related headline to Capcom's financial briefings where you see Switch 2 version helps Street Fighter 6 reach major sales milestone. Street Fighter 6 is now the second best selling entry ever. So Switch 2 versions of some of these third-party games, as they do hit, I do believe will boost up these numbers for certain select titles in a big way. Elden Ring being like an already massive franchise, 20 or 25 million copies sold or whatever it's at now, absolutely astronomical numbers, especially considering that, yes, it's on all platforms other than Nintendo right now, but for a game to do those type of numbers and not have like the name of Mario or Zelda or, Nintendo's juggernaut franchises, even a God of War from Sony or something like that, like to hit those numbers and not have that type of name attached to it, definitely big stuff. And I wonder what that will boost those ultimate sales up to whenever we get the tarnished edition of Elden Ring released on Switch 2. Okay, from here, we have Nintendo Switch 2 micro SD Express to M.2 SSD adapter is in the works. And it kind of is a lengthy article to read through, so I'm just going to hit the high points. The project's GitHub, which launched this week, provided information that the process revealing such an adapter is made possible because of the console's micro SD Express card slot supports the SD Express 7.1 standard, which exposes a true PCIe Gen 3 X1 interface and utilizes the NVMe protocol for communication. As such, the adapter maps PCIe X1 from the Switch 2's microSD Express slot to a standard M.2 2230 NVMe SSD, and no protocol translation is required as Nintendo Switch 2 host controller handles everything. So the long and short of it is that with what these people are working on, and there does have to be some things figured out in the voltage department for this, it does seem like one day we might see some kind of adapter that you can actually plug in an SSD, an M.2 SSD, like what I have in my computer to run my operating system, Windows, on. These are much larger capacity than what your 1 terabyte, Lexar micro SD express card slots can support right now. And while I don't think this will be a widespread option that a lot of people opt for, if they do get this working and you can have like a 4 terabyte M.2 drive and it just works for your entire like massive digital library of Switch 1 and Switch 2 games, I do think that's going to be a cool thing for certain people out there, because right now at 256 gigabytes, if you imported your whole Switch 1 library, or at least a decent chunk of it, and you're starting to download new Switch 2 games just at the launch of the console, you're probably getting close to full on storage. I mean, at least that's been my experience so far, and I'm already picking and choosing what titles I want to leave installed and which ones not. Now, of course, if you picked up a big micro SD express card, that definitely helps, but 1 terabyte is about as big as those go for now. That may change in the future, obviously, but this could be something that for massive game libraries out there one day, you're still going to be covered with something like this if we do ultimately see it figured out and brought to market. Okay, the last couple of stories, just quick ones here, highlights. This is Nintendo Switch 2 setting that can improve HDR in your TV mode. I actually mentioned this in one of my tips and tricks videos for Nintendo Switch 2, but I do want to highlight it once again because as pointed out here by the article, you have, as pointed out by YouTuber My Life in Gaming, after adjusting the peak brightness setting, there is another prompt that can be triggered with the Y button that brings the user another brightness slider. This is, however, the paper white slider, which is completely different than the peak brightness slider, as HDR savvy users already know. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up again is it is a separate slider, and I did not know that at the time. I wasn't sure if it was entirely different than the initial setup you go through here. It is totally different, and you kind of want to adjust both of them, but you want to kind of see what it needs to look like for your particular TV. So after doing the peak brightness slider, you can then go in and adjust this slider. And if you don't do that, if you're noticing your colors looking very overexposed or something kind of looks off with your HDR settings, go in and hit this Y button after you do the HDR setup with the peak brightness, and go in and adjust basically that other brightness slider, because it's not incredibly clear and Nintendo doesn't throw it in your face that you need to do that. Kind of seems like an optional thing, but that does tend to help out with getting your colors looking more correct, let's say, if you feel like anything's off with the HDR settings. Okay, the very last headline you can see here, official Metroid Prime retrospective book delayed to October. This was originally scheduled to come out over the summer in June, as it's highlighted here, but will now be released worldwide on October 28th. Now, There was some, you know, obviously speculation about the fact that we're getting a retrospective book for Metroid Prime 2, 3, and well, obviously 1, it's the trilogy. Would there be an announcement of those games at some time corresponding with the book's launch? Well, now that kind of goes out the window because they're delaying it back, and I don't think the Metroid Prime 4 is going to have any delay past October of this year. That game will already be out. So if we are to have any glimmer of hope for Prime 2 and 3, they have to happen pretty much as a shadow drop announcement at the next direct over the summer. And if they're not coming then at that point, Nintendo is just going to forget about those games until they get added onto NSO in the future or something like that, which Prime 2 Echoes, perfect candidate for the GameCube NSO, but Prime 3 Corruption is a Wii game, and we would definitely need, you know, some additional systems like the Wii to be added in to play that one. So I'm hoping we get some updates on Prime 2 and 3 and where they're at over the summer. But if you are somebody who is keeping your eye on this retrospective book like I have been, just a heads up, can't get it quite as soon as you originally maybe hoped. It now is delayed until the 28th of October for its launch, and here's hoping we get some Prime 2 and 3 news in addition to the release date for Prime 4 over this June time period where we're expecting Nintendo to hopefully hold their next direct. So let me know what you think about all the different stories today. Are you interested in MIG Switch working on Switch 2 at all? What do you make of these dev kit Switch 2 photos that we now have? Capcom counting the physical game key cards as digital sales. Are they a digital game in your mind, or are they still physical, and will you be picking them up as part of your physical collection this generation? Would you pick up something like an M.2 drive that supports full SSD storage compatibility for the Switch 2 if you can get something like 4 or 6 or 8 terabytes or something crazy like that? What do you think of the HDR in Switch 2? And do you have any hope left for Metroid Prime 2 and 3 in terms of a release on the Switch 2 before we get that Prime 4? So make sure you share all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below before you leave, regardless if we agree or disagree. Also, make sure you like, subscribe, turn your notification bell. And with that, I've been Sunbro, you've been Nation. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.